Additional aids and services are available to individuals with disabilities. To make such a request, please contact us by email, by clicking the Help tab in the PD portal, or at pdportal@tamu.edu, by phone, including Relay Texas at 1-800-441-7323, or in writing to Train PD, PD Portal Support, 4477 TAMU, College Station, Texas 77843. Both a transcript and accessible document of the content presented in this webinar can be found as resources in the course description. Click on the blue links under Course Resources in the description. When a link is clicked, a new browser window will open.
And he currently works for Tyson Foods in the digital and automation upskilling area. And we are very fortunate to have him today, as he is also the former State Director of Adult Education and Literacy here in Texas. I will let Anson go ahead and add anything he would like to in terms of what he's currently working on. But welcome, Anson. Thank you so much for your time.
Yeah, I'm so happy to be here. Thanks for having me on, and I hope we have a really good presentation today. I wanted to invite people to put your name in the chat and let us know who you are and kind of build some community here as we talk about a real important topic. As Wendy mentioned, I worked in Texas my whole career, was state director for about 7 years, but before that, ran a training center in San Antonio, the Westside Education Training Center. And I bring that up because probably few people know this, but the pictures that are on the PowerPoint template here that you're looking at are from the Westside Education and Training Center from years ago. And they've been on that PowerPoint template for a long time because they're great pictures. So I'm real happy to be here. Now I work for Tyson Foods. And so there is like career trajectories from adult ed, if you're wondering. And I found a really fulfilling one. I got hired initially to help manage the Upward Academy program you might have heard of, which is the adult education program that some of you probably support in your local areas, which is doing adult education in the Tyson plants in your communities. I did that for a few years, but recently got reorganized to put my talents related to working with frontline workers and immigrants and refugees to work on supporting Tyson's huge initiatives related to building more digital network and connectivity in our plants and equipment, as well as robotics and automation. So helping immigrant and refugee and low-skilled workers use automation equipment and stuff. So that's what I'm doing now. It's great. I do it for the United States, and then also supporting some plants in Thailand and China. So it's a pretty exciting day for me typically. But I want to talk and get back to something that is one of my passions, which is engaging employers and cultivating this workplace education program that's thriving. A lot of you guys, and I'm so proud of Texas as being such a leader when it comes to working with businesses, but we can always find ways to get better and think about that work differently. So if you join this, you're probably on that journey yourself. So I want to share some tips and would love to also hear from you in the chat, things that you've learned or questions that you have as we go through here. And I want to try to keep this as interactive as possible. So yeah, if you're just joining, put your name in the chat and tell us who you are, and we'll get going here. So I'm going to kind of lead this by talking about the topic of employer engagement and working with employers from the lens of an employer and what employers think, and also from the lens of you, from adult education providers and leaders' points of view. So we'll look at it in those two separate lenses, and I think it's a good way to frame different things that we can look at. So one thing you might be asking yourself is like, well, what on earth does an employer need from adult education? What do they see when they think of adult education, and what is the value that we can bring to them? Well, I listed a few things here. You may have others. You're welcome to put those in the chat, but definitely they see adult education providers as people that know a lot about the growing workforce in our communities, which is largely an immigrant and refugee workforce, which is really the net growth in many areas of the state, if not all of them, meaning most of the growth in businesses and their employees is going to come from that population just due to the demographics. So employers don't know a lot about immigrant and refugee populations. You do. So that is one of the first things in terms of like a way to kind of think of the value you bring is that you're an expert on a segment of the workforce that is growing and the one that they know least about. And that's probably one of the most important things to take away from this is that you have that value in terms of your perspectives. Businesses, because of demographics, are very interested in bicultural and bilingual workers. And so there again, you have those individuals in your programs. Many years ago, when I started, not speaking English was kind of a real negative for the workforce. It was like they got to learn English before they can go to work. And that's still true. They need English, not for all jobs, of course, but English is always going to help somebody's career trajectory. But being bilingual is even more important because so many positions now require individuals that can switch between different languages to support either their customers or their clients or their patients or whatever it happens to be. So that bilingualism is something, again, as you work on building English, sometimes students think, well, I don't have a lot of English. I'm not very employable. It's not the case. Sometimes that bilingualism is something you can really build that asset focus for what they bring to the table. Businesses definitely believe that international talent, other ideas, really improve their business and their business models. And so they see immigrants as fueling innovation, new ways of thinking, new ways of getting information from workers in their communities. And then I bring up two terms that you may be familiar with, maybe not: DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion, and then ESG, which is much less popular in usage, but it's out there: environment, social, and governance. And what these are areas that businesses have made commitments to, saying we're going to hire more workers from this population group, or we're going to be more cognizant of our communities that we work in and how we can support them in their growth. And so working with immigrant and refugee populations and others is a way for them to meet these DEI objectives. And in fact, when I started working at Tyson, that was the main reason they were involved in adult education. It was not about helping workers be more productive. That never came up, actually. They were interested in being good stewards to their communities and helping the areas where Tyson does business with their plants, matriculate those workers into good paying jobs and hiring from that workforce. So it's not always about the bottom line. And that's a really good thing about this. You've got a lot of different angles that employers see value in. Here's some other areas that employers see value. Probably the biggest one in terms of costs is what I call turnover aversion, which means trying to reduce people that quit jobs quickly or at all. Turnover in frontline work is extremely high sometimes, up to 70 and 80%. 100% in some occupations. That's very, very costly to a business. It costs between $6,000 and I heard the other day $10,000 to replace a frontline worker. I'm not talking about a manager. So these are the baked in costs of recruiting new workers and training new workers and bringing them through orientation. All those costs add up. Well, if a worker stays 3 weeks and leaves, that's just flushed down the toilet, that cost. So businesses know when you invest in their workers at all levels, they stay longer. And at Tyson, where I work, we have data that shows 131% return on investment because of people being enrolled in ESL. That means we get a big return on the students that are in ESL in terms of staying with the company versus those that don't go to ESL classes. So that's a big dollar sign for businesses. Talent attraction is another area that you really have a great leg up. When businesses look at education in general and adult education for sure, they see workers in their minds, your students, they see workers who are committed to doing something like going back to school, that are bettering themselves, that are building skills. That's a better hiring pool to hire from than people off the street just cold walking into your business. And so your students to them are really good hires, and they want to get in front of those students. If you work with businesses, you probably know this. They always like to go and do presentations and stuff like that. Also, they see that by being engaged with you, you can act as kind of a consultant to the business in areas they may not know much about. I just was contacted by a Toyota supplier here in San Antonio who called me up because he had seen on LinkedIn that we in our Seguin, Texas plant had hired a lot of Afghan workers. He called me up out of the cold, out of the blue. I never knew who this person was and said, "Hey, can you help us make our workplace more accommodating for the cultural, religious, and other areas so that we don't alienate these Afghan workers that we're hiring early on? We want to make sure we have a welcoming workplace." Well, that's something you know all about because just by incidental contact with students, you've learned a lot about cultural, religious customs, and other things. So that's something other than adult education that you bring to the table as an expertise. And that one, it comes up all the time because go back to what I said earlier. Businesses know very little about these populations and they want to know more. Here's even some more value. They see you as someone with labor market expertise in these special populations. You may be the first people to hear in your community that a new refugee population is coming to town. And maybe you go to meeting with your economic development folks or your workforce board folks, or your radar is up because to you, a new refugee population coming to the community is more students. To the business, they're like, hey, these are new hires possibly. So you have early indicators of labor market information that the business may not know. The second one's one of my passions, as some of you know, finding and tapping into hidden talent. And what I mean by that is internationally trained professionals or skilled immigrant businesses. And I do this at Tyson all the time. I go to HR managers and I'll look at them in the eye and what if I told you that out of the 680 immigrant and refugee workers in this Tyson plant, no less than 10 to 15% of them have college degrees? Because that's a number I know because of any general population of immigrants, a good subset have college degrees. You guys know this. Their minds are always blown because to them, they see talent that's not being adequately utilized in the plant. So there we have another value that you bring to the table that businesses are very eager to know because they don't know that because businesses collect very little information often on frontline workers. They don't ask like we do in adult ed, tell me about your education in your former country and all those good questions that we ask in our enrollment. Businesses and entry level workers ask very little. So they don't know that they have doctors, engineers, lawyers hiding amongst their ranks. And as soon as they learn that, they're like, oh my God, if we just help them with English, we've already got someone here that's got these bilingual and bicultural high skilled assets that the company can use. And then the last point on this slide is you can be a real valuable broker of other connections. You are connected to your workforce board. You are connected to grants that are coming out and economic development happenings. And so that means you can bring things to the business about opportunities. Maybe you're working with your community college or you are a community college and you're going to write a big grant. Well, the business would love to be a part of that, and they won't know that until they talk to somebody. So you could be that broker of information that could bring great value and training, for example, to the business. Some other areas are reputational benefits that the employers get. And let me to explain, that's kind of a weird phrase, reputational benefits. But here's what happens when a business starts hiring from an immigrant population, for example, word travels around just like it does in adult ed. You have a good experience as a student in adult ed, and all of a sudden you bring your cousins, your friends, your relatives, everybody's coming to class. Same thing happens to businesses. If workers find an employer that is maybe offering ESL classes, that is accommodating to other cultures, they're going to tell their friends and their cousins and everybody. And that becomes a big deal because now you've got a resource pipeline for new workers from word of mouth, which is like gold to a business. I'll tell you a little anecdote. At Tyson Foods in the US, you would never guess it, but I'm going to ask you if you can guess it. In the chat at Tyson Foods across the United States, what do you think the third biggest language is? So first would be English, second would be Spanish. What do you think the third is? Burmese. Oh, Vietnamese, Burmese. Oh, you guys are cheating. You know something here. Yeah, you're right. Burmese, not French, not Vietnamese. Burmese is the third biggest language. I'm proud of you guys. You probably teach in Tyson plants. Um, Burmese is the third biggest language at Tyson, not because it's the third biggest language in the United States. It's because word of mouth. The Burmese population quickly learned that when they came to the US, Tyson was a good employer that paid good benefits and good wages and accommodated their lack of skills. And the Burmese is one population that, as you know, sometimes are non-literate in their own language. They're very, very low skilled, but they can make good money at Tyson and have good benefits and speak no English and don't have literacy. So word travels like that around quick. And so you go to communities where there's large populations of Burmese and there's typically a Tyson plant somewhere around because they cluster around Tyson plants. I was just in Indiana a couple of months ago and I saw Burmese workers that I had seen in Amarillo. And they came up to me and said, like, we remember you from Texas. And I'm like, yeah. They're like, well, we're from Amarillo because they had kind of moved to another Tyson plant in Indiana because they knew this. So that is like gold if you've got committed populations that are following you around for employment and telling their friends and relatives. So a very, very big point being an employer of choice within that area. It also builds the reputation of the business as a good collaborator, someone that's good to do business with. And you guys know this working with IETs and stuff. You know which businesses you always come back to do projects with because they are accommodating and that just brings more value to you, but also value to them. And then even internally for you, when you're talking to your peers, other teachers, other adult ed directors, whoever, you are quick to say, oh, I love this business. We work with them in our community. You should be working with them too, because you had a good experience and maybe somebody else in a different community would have a good experience with that same business. So you're acting as an advocate for the business too. So these are really important and almost priceless elements that build the employer's confidence and resiliency in the local community that are just things that accrue to you being engaged in providing services. It's not about just the bottom line. You're bringing all kinds of value to the business. All right, let's pivot here to the tips of working with employers and the pitfalls, things you don't want to do working with employers. So you have both sides of it. One good tip is to put yourself in the employer's shoes and really do your best to understand what they want and need. Now, that's easy to say, but it means you have to really become an active listener. And I always tell people when you work with a business, especially the first meeting, you know very little about the business. You've probably done some research and stuff like that. You've talked to students that maybe work there. So you know something, but not a lot. And the business knows probably little or nothing about you. So that first meeting is real important. And it's where you really have those listening skills tweaked out because you really want to be listening well to the business and hearing and reading in between the lines what they're saying. So you want to understand what are the language and cultural skills that they would benefit from. Like I always tell people, if you look at certain plants, and you can do this by talking to students, you know where your students work, and the teachers surely do. Well, those businesses, if they all work at Tyson or they all work somewhere else in your community, that means that place is accommodating to immigrants and refugees and others. So that means that's an easy place to go make an entry because you already know that your students are working there. So they're accommodating. So that's the first thing you can do. You can kind of understand they've got some higher level of engagement when it comes to language and cultural skills. You can ask the business about their DEI and ESG commitments. Have they made those commitments? What are they? Do they want to hire X percentage of certain populations in their community over the next year? Because that means you can fuel that pipeline and help them out. The big one, I think, is always what are their challenges related to growth, hiring, and retraining these individuals? And I'll tell you a little bit about that in the next one. So, also, what technology disruptors, I call them, are shifting the way they've attracted talent. So those last 2 points are really important because our workforce and our business models are rapidly changing right now. Those of you that were around back when computers and the internet first came on board, that was this big disruption of technology in the workplace. All of a sudden, people had computers and they had to use this thing called email. And there was all this training that had to happen. And it was very quick. The same thing is happening now, but it's with all kinds of other digital systems and robotics and automation, which is what I do. So the place where companies are faced right now, and I talk to a lot of business leaders in other businesses about this, is their population is becoming more diverse and more language diverse, as I said earlier. And technology is coming on strong. Those two things on the surface are incompatible. Higher tech, lower skilled, non English workforces. That seems like a collision, but that is happening no matter what the business can do about it. They're going to have to hire from their populations in their communities, and they're going to have to upgrade technology and add automation if they want to stay in business. They're just immovable objects. You are perfectly positioned to play in that space because you understand the populations and you do training, you do IETs, you know how to teach those populations. And that's why I got moved into working on digital and automation at Tyson. They said, hey, adult education services are great, but we need you to help us because we're going to invest $1.5 billion with a B into robotics and automation. And we want to make sure people can use this equipment. And you know how to close that gap. That is a huge value for a company. And that's something everybody on this call can do. So that is a questions about new technologies and all of that. They don't want to have to hire new workers. They've got great workers. They have loyal workers. They don't want to have to bring in new people. And there's this kind of when it comes to automation, which I know a lot about right now, there's this bias or this reputation of automation, which has got some truth to it. I'm not going to lie, that robots and automation are going to kill jobs and take jobs away. And that does happen. I'm not going to kid you. But the more important thing to focus on is not the job loss because the workers really don't lose their jobs. They just get shifted to another line in the Tyson plant or the business because they're loyal and they're good workers. But the business, what they really are worried about is how do the existing workers use this equipment? How can we train them? And so being able to build an IET for robotic automation, which I'm doing all over the country, those kind of things are like so important to businesses, but they don't know how to do it. You do. So keep that in mind. You have great value. If you're new at this, some of you joined this thing and said like, hey, I got to get into this game with businesses. My message to you is don't go it alone. Find partners that you can do this with because you need to learn the ropes and get confident yourself. And you don't have to be the one making the cold call to the business or talking to them for the first time. So workforce boards, community college, training departments, economic development chambers, these are all great people in your communities that you work with already, many of them, that are already talking to businesses. Go to their meeting, get invited. If you're at a community college and you know your customized training department is working with a big company, have them bring you to the meeting because a business might need that Six Sigma high skill training that the college is going to sell them. But I bet you they also need frontline worker preparation, almost without a doubt. And that way you can be part of an equation to bring more value to the business because you can take care of that frontline work. So good tips there at a glance. Here are some other ones. This first one I've learned the hard way sometimes. The first person you meet is not always the best contact. So you go to a workforce board meeting and you meet somebody and they're out of business and you're so excited and they're excited and it's just fantastic. And you feel like, okay, now I got my foot in the door. Well, that person may be the best person to talk to about training, but they just were at that workforce board meeting. They may be in a different area of the company. And so when you start talking to them, maybe ask at the beginning, like, hey, are there other people we could bring to the meeting? Like, do you have a training department? Can I talk to them? Because it's just good to make sure that you're not going down the rabbit trail with somebody that's not really the best contact. And they may not realize it themselves. And so it's always good to ask, how do you broaden the kind of team that's under the umbrella there and bring them all to the table so you can talk about skills. And the second one is, don't eat the elephant all at once. Start small, pick a few employers, pick one, and have a good experience, because you need to build your confidence if you're new at this. Set some reasonable expectations. I have a new publication coming that just came out, and we'll talk about it a little bit. It's free, so you'll get it for free. But one of the things I say is, like, your first objective is getting the first meeting and getting the second meeting. Because if you get invited back to the business, you've made a positive impression. If they never call you back, something didn't work. So that's a reasonable expectation, that you're not even doing any ESL or anything. You're not providing a service, but you just want to build that relationship and then start small. If they've got 800 immigrant and refugees or 300, you're not going to train them all at once. And you'll often think, oh my God, they've got thousands or hundreds of, immigrant and refugee populations. We're going to have 5 classes. Be happy with one. Get one class and have a good start to this, because sometimes your eyes are bigger than your stomach on these relationships, and that's a recipe for challenges along the way. And then be ready to make mid-course adjustments. And this is hard for education in general, I understand. You commit to a class, you've dedicated a teacher for a semester, and you're going to stick with it. But if the business says, hey, we need to change the times of this class, and you're 6 weeks in, you need to respond to that, because what they're saying is, if we don't change the times, this class is going to go poof. So we're good at that in adult ed, but sometimes it bumps up against some of our systems in our colleges or in our provider systems to kind of bump and roll with things like that. So be prepared for that at the beginning, and then it's not as much of a shock. All right. Okay. Now let's talk about the pitfalls. The pitfalls are like the things that either I've done or I've seen happen or people do themselves. And I definitely think these are important to keep in mind. So the first pitfall is one that might be hard to believe, but many businesses don't even know that adult education exists. They don't know that there's a field called English as a second language, because they're not in our world. They're in another world. And so always make sure you spend time introducing what you do and where you are and what kind of people you serve. Do an adequate introduction. I've met businesses that have vague notions about their community college because they've never worked with them. And I mean, everybody on this call would think, how could a business not know about their local community college at all? And it's because they don't swim in that lake. So be sure to take time to introduce what you do in the services you do. Briefly, we'll talk about that a little bit, but don't assume they know adult education. The second one I mentioned earlier, but don't assume that the employer understands a lot about the skill needs of frontline workers, entry-level workers. Oftentimes, these workers are hired by temp agencies, or they're hired in kind of cattle call hiring events, as only the minimum information is collected on the workers to meet their requirement for hiring, and then it's done. And I've just met dozens and dozens of workers at Tyson, probably hundreds, that the managers, HR managers and all, know little about, even though they might have worked there 15 years. I've had conversations with HR managers, and I'll say, oh, do you know this individual? They're like, oh, yeah, he works on line 5. And I said, did you know that he's like an engineer from Bolivia? And they're like, oh my God, I never knew. So that worker might have been working there for a decade and no one asked him the question, and it's not on any kind of hiring form. So there's hidden jewels and hidden talents. And this goes for businesses in general in terms of skill needs. The other thing, and I think this comes up later in the discussion, they don't know how long learning takes for underskilled workers. And sometimes they don't know how long learning takes for everybody, honestly. But what I mean by that is, if they have a group of Karenni speaking workers that 20% of them can read in their native language, they might assume they can learn English in 6 months or 6 weeks or something, and that's just because they don't know. They don't know how long that takes. And so 2 messages for you: make sure that you're honest with them about what a program of study would look like, but also build for yourself really tangible early benchmarks of learning that you can go back to the business and show, because you're not going to show a completely fluent Karenni speaking worker in 6 weeks necessarily, but you're going to show something, and you might want to really think about what that would be to show. And I always used to tell my staff at the college, and now I tell them at Tyson, like, we need to show an outcome of some sort in a week or two. Anything, workers coming in and saying good morning or good evening, something simple if they're very low skilled. Don't wait till the end of the semester. And it's definitely not about like EFL gains and stuff. They don't care about that. They want to see tangible things, and they can be small, and that really means a lot. The third one on the left there really bothers me, but there's sometimes an assumption that people have that employers don't care about frontline workers, that they're expendable just because they're lower paid. That's not true. Their businesses typically are fueled by frontline lower skilled workers. They're typically the largest group of workers in many facilities and many companies, and they cost a lot to retrain and replace. And so they care a lot about frontline workers, and so they will make those investments. And then the last one there, leading with that assumption that the businesses know how long it's going to take to raise people's skills. So those are some common pitfalls, and I have some other ones here. And this is more about, some of these are about like the meeting. So picture yourself, and you've probably got examples of this in your mind if you've done it yourself. You're in the meeting with the business. And remember, I said earlier, that's a big listening event for you. But these are common things that I have done myself sometimes, and I've seen happen too. So one is leading with your needs, not the needs of the employer. So maybe you're in a pinch because you want to get your performance measures for your workplace literacy class met. And so you're obsessing over getting another 29 enrollments in workplace literacy by the end of the program year. I know it. Business doesn't care about that. So don't lead with that as why you're there, because they don't care about that. They don't understand what you're talking about. You need to be listening to them. It's important. There's no doubt about it, but that's not what you lead with. I also see a pitfall related to people not taking the sufficient amount of time to get something started. And what I mean by that is, if you want to start a class in the spring semester, you're probably too late right now with a business sitting here at the end of September. Now, you're used to moving fast, I know, but sometimes the business, if they're new at this, takes a long time to figure it out and to get excited, and they have to brief it, and they have to figure out the logistics. How will the workers get to class? Where will we have the class? What time will it be? There's a lot of sausage making that goes into this, as you know. So don't rush into these relationships. And when I used to work as state director, I remember the AEL providers that I really learned a lot from myself were the ones that gave lots of lead time to working with businesses. And that's good. It takes the pressure off you, and it gives them time to really build things as they need to be. Third one's probably obvious, but man, we have a hard time with this in education. Jargon, jargon, jargon. And businesses do this too. Understand your employer's jargon, because they're going to say terms you never heard. And I hear this every day at Tyson, and I'm always having to ask, what does that mean, guys? But don't go in talking about EFLs or MSGs or program years or adult basic education or IET. They don't know those terms, even though that's the stock of our trade. So talk in plain language when it comes to those kind of things, and they will connect very well. But it's hard to untrain ourselves from talking about that, because we're more used to talking amongst ourselves and not to folks on the outside. Now, the second column, first one there, y'all would probably say, well, Anson's a heretic because he used to be state director, and I can't believe he's saying this. But I think you've got to be willing to fail when you're working with business. And that means failing your measures. Now, that just like sounds like heresy, I know, and probably everybody's going to click off this presentation. But I will tell you, the new relationship with the business is a risky proposition. And I mean is, you're new to this business. They're new to you. The timing might not be right. The businesses have fickle business cycles where they're really busy and then they're not busy, and they're really busy and they're not busy. You have to be willing to take a risk. And if you do that, that's sometimes the first signal to a business that you're committed. But if you're over there with a gun to your head for performance, or your boss wants something to happen and it is really high stakes for you, doing this with the business might not be your best move, because you just are in a new relationship and those things take time. So it's good to know what you can sacrifice before you meet with the employer. It could be enrollments, it could be performance measures, it could be time. These things take time. And so as you kind of forecast doing this work, you've got to really take those things into measure and not put all your eggs in one basket. And I just can't underestimate that enough, because what happens if it does take longer than you think? And all of a sudden, what you thought was going to happen this program year gets pushed in the next program year. Well, you're going to that deficit mode and you're thinking, oh, I failed. I'm going to fail my measures. This is terrible. The business, you disengage from the business because you're looking for a way to fix the problem. And then you've spent a lot of time and gotten nowhere. So it's good to think about that, have that discussion with your leaders. But it's like with anything in life. If you don't take the risk, you sometimes can't find the reward. But yeah, it's a risky one out there sometimes. And that's why doing your homework up front and getting more assured that you're going to be able to make this work is important. And I can't underestimate the time commitment. I tell people, when you're setting up a new relationship with a business, be prepared to spend a quarter of the time just scheduling and getting the class to fit around the schedule. A quarter of the time, which seems like a lot, but you're working in a service into an existing, often very busy day for workers and also their daily lives. And so we're used to scheduling things pretty quickly in our own institutions because we have complete control. Well, now you're having to schedule not only the class with the business and the workers with the class, but also your teacher to the plant or to the factory or wherever it happens to be. There's a lot of time spent on logistics and getting that right. Because if you don't have the logistics right, nothing else happens. So it becomes really important that, and I've seen it over and over with classes at Tyson, the investment's not made up front, and the class that we thought was going to have 32 has 7. And maybe we recruited 100, but we couldn't even get 32 because we didn't plan the schedule well enough, or we didn't see something coming when it comes to the schedule. Workers commute from other communities and things like that. So building that time is really, really important. And then I mentioned this last point here. Another pitfall is you could be just working with the wrong. All right, so I'm going to open it up for questions, and I hope you guys have some. I'm here to share. I see something in the chat from Alba. Recommendations to organizations to find funding to pay instructors to facilitate workplace literacy programs, specifically for small literacy organizations that do not receive. Okay, yes. How do we pay for this thing? Well, if you're an AFLA provider, you can take care of that typically with your funds. If you're not an AFLA provider, keep this in mind. The business is used to paying for training. You're used to giving stuff away. Those two things are incompatible. And so don't be afraid to early in the conversation they're expecting to pay often. And I've told federally funded providers, we'll pay for it. And we do that right now at Tyson. We pay for teachers in some places because the constraints on the class are such that I know it's going to hurt their performance measures in AFLA. Maybe the business wants to start a class May 18th. Well, I know that's a suicide mission for MSGs. So I'll say, we'll pay for the first 6 months and we'll take the pain out of it. So businesses are used to paying for workers and they see value when they pay for stuff. Then your job is just to deliver. So Alba, I'll tell you, nonprofits, in my experience, and I'm not beating up on anybody, but they are often really good at working with businesses because they're entrepreneurial. They're used to asking for money. They're used to bumping and rolling with economic conditions. They have to survive not on a federal grant, but on what they can bring in and institutional funds from other types of resources like United Way. So to me, I think asking for funding is definitely on the table. And then, of course, there's so much money available through workforce boards, economic development. If companies are expanding, there's also money coming to the table for different things. Let them know that you're looking for funding. And I've seen that to be very, very important. Researching and finding business partners. I'm glad you asked that, Amy. So her question is, if you do not have access to a research group or labor market team, what are the recommendations for researching and finding business partners? So I'll tell you a few. First, talk to your students. Like I said earlier, if there's a preponderance of students that are working in certain businesses, that's a go-to place because that means they're already hiring from your populations. They're already in need of basic skills because they're in your classes. That's an early indicator. That's just an easy one. The other one is think of businesses that would have large populations of low-skilled workers. ones that come to mind are going to be manufacturing, because manufacturing largely relies on some level of production worker talent, which is frontline. It might not be IT, which is typically working with higher skilled workers that have, sort of certifications or something in IT programming or something. So you can even pick by organization, kind of industry cluster. The other area that I would advise you to look at is healthcare. Think of areas, healthcare, I'm going to reuse healthcare as an example, but think of areas where bilingualism and other languages are valuable. There's two of them that always come to mind. Teaching, so like teacher's aide and those entry level positions at a public school, because our communities have diverse populations in our public schools. They need liaisons that speak Laotian, that speak Burmese, that speak other languages. Those are places where bilingual and biculturalism is valuable. Healthcare is the other one. If I'm at a hospital, I'm serving my community. Well, if there's a, God forbid, an accident that brings people into the emergency room and they speak another language that we don't have on staff, wouldn't it be nice to know that there's somebody on staff that can help be an interpreter for the family or for the healthcare provider or for the individual themselves? I know in San Antonio, because I've worked with them, several of the hospitals can tell you at any time of day what languages they have on staff. Now, that might be somebody working in the commissary or someone working cleaning rooms, but they know that if we need to leverage another language, we can find that person. So that's where the bilingualism becomes an asset. That's a second area that you can look at. And the last I'll tell you is go to workforce board meetings, especially if the board has meetings that are like an education or training subcommittee. Go to economic development meetings, because that's the early indicator that new businesses are coming to town or trying to stay in town, but they can't find workers and they may have to move. So those are places where you have to spend, and that's why I was bringing up spending the time earlier. Sometimes you got to spend some time learning and building your skills so that you can learn the best path forward for yourself. And then don't do it alone. Every workforce board has a business service unit. Every college has a customized training department. They talk to businesses all day long. That's what they wake up to do. Hitch your little wagon to those meetings and maybe just come along to listen the first few times. They'll let you go. But they really see you as valuable, because I used to be a business service person at the Alamo Workforce Board. I always was schlepping adult ed and ESL because that was my background. And businesses always wanted those services too. So we would do high skilled technical training and ESL. So to a business service person at a board or a community college customized training person, you're kind of broadening their bag of tricks on what they can offer the business community. And that's really valuable to them. So they're leading the meeting. You're just bringing in your expertise and it takes the pressure off. So those are some of the suggestions I have. Other questions?
In your experience, have you noticed that employers have a bigger need or desire for regular like ESL or HSC classes versus IET setups?
I say, here's my answer to that. They don't know IET exists and they love it. And they sometimes know ESL exists and English is a big pain point. So I wouldn't say one or the other is more, but most likely, if you're starting these kind of things, I would start with ESL just because it's easier to do and takes less people. Because as soon as you start doing IETs at businesses, I'm not going to say it's not a good idea. You just have to be prepared, because that means you're bringing along your training expert and the business has to pull their training expert. You're just increasing the number of people that need to be involved. But I can tell you, if the gap you're filling is the gap I fill every day, which is you're going to spend $1 million on equipment, automation equipment or other things, let's make sure that the workers that already have those positions can use it. Then you're doing an IET and you're saying, okay, I got to learn how to use I got to build some training around this, and your community college can probably train around the equipment. And then we got to teach the relevant English skills. And that's what I do all day. I build ESL and upskilling for IETs related to automation equipment and other digital tools and stuff. So if you're ready to jump into that, it's got high value, but it's a lot more work at the front. So it depends on like how you feel it out. But if I was starting over, I'd probably say, let's get a good success with an ESL class, and then we'll go into the training next semester or in 6 months or whatever it happens to be. All right, well, here's what y'all have been waiting for. This just got published last week. I put together a guide called Beyond the First Meeting, a guide to beginning and cultivating a thriving workplace education program. Absolutely free. And what I just told you this last hour and more is embedded in this. I've been working on it for many years. I've got a lot of good people that help me put it together. But I think it's so important for adult education to be in this game because of our changing demographics. We want our companies to grow and hire, and we want our students to get employed in those companies, but we're the ones that are best positioned to do that work. So pull it down. It's pretty short, easy to read. I try to make it great. If you see suggestions, always, you know how to find me. You can write me, but definitely something you can take down and print out right now. And I hear the printers in the background already, so I'm thrilled about that. Another thing, if you listen to podcasts, I have a podcast called Behind Every Employer. And you can just go into iTunes or YouTube or wherever you listen, and you can find Behind Every Employer. And here's what this is. I sit down with businesses, and these are businesses that have already bought into adult ed. And some of them are very sophisticated and doing a great job. Some of them are just beginning. And I talk to the business, and sometimes I do it with their provider. So it'll be me, a business in Milwaukee, and their local adult ed provider. And we talk about adult education, low skilled students at work, and what the businesses are doing and need to do to close the gap. So if you're interested in hearing from the mouth of businesses, the podcast is a great place to do that. You can find it podcast apps. And if you're driving from work, you can just plop it on. The episodes are between 30 and 40 minutes long, and we have a lot of fun. It's not some boring education podcast that you heard sometimes. This one, we try to have fun and spice it up. And we got a great schedule this fall coming out with some new businesses. So I'll say that and go check it out. But I'll also say, if you have a relationship you want to brag about with a business, bring it to the podcast and we'll interview you, because I'm always looking for good examples. Texas is leading the pack with employer engagement. Let's make sure, I should have said that at the beginning, but that is a culture we have built, and y'all are very engaged on that. So bring it to the podcast. It's very casual, very easy to do. Takes a couple of hours of your life, 1 hour to plan it and 1 hour to do it. And then you have something you can share with your local partners and say, hey, not only do we have an adult education program, but we got a podcast to tell you what we do over there.
We hope you enjoyed this pre-recorded webinar. After you have passed the final test with a score of 80% or greater and have received your certificate of completion, please take a few moments to complete the course evaluation. Participant feedback helps Train PD at TCAL continue to provide high-quality professional development. To leave a course feedback, please go to the completed portion of your transcript. To do this, hover over the My Learning tab and select View Your Transcript. Click on the drop-down arrow next to the word Active and select Completed. Then,